Hello, I'm Jonasz Lewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we dive into Georgia, where the recently elected President Mikhail Saakashvili chose Azerbaijan for his first official visit abroad. Now, to the untrained eye, that might seem like a polite nod to a friendly neighbor. But in the South Caucasus, nothing is ever just a polite nod. It's more like a strategic wink layered over a centuries-long staring contest. In Baku, Saakashvili met with President Aliyev, who, as you'll perhaps remember, has recently been dishing out hot takes on the European Union. He called the EU's treatment of Georgia colonial and accused Brussels of meddling in domestic affairs of the country, a sentiment Saakashvili echoed comfortably. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest reports to find out more.
Azerbaijan and Georgia are looking to strengthen ties and work together to bring some stability to their region. This was the main tenet of the new Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili's meeting with Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev. By choosing Azerbaijan as his first foreign trip, Saakashvili showed the world a change in Georgia's policy. Where once it was focused on the West, Georgia is now turning to neighbors and regional partners like Azerbaijan.
We must continue fostering relationships with both of our neighbors, Azerbaijan and Armenia, within this framework.
There is a key difference between the Georgian dream and its regional partners. Georgia currently doesn't have all that many allies. It focused the last several years on deep integration with Western structures. This new pivot may essentially set the country's policy back almost a decade. At the same time, Azerbaijan, for example, is building itself up as a regional leader. It maintains good relations with Russia, while also pursuing new avenues of cooperation with world powers like China. Whereas Armenia, under the leadership of Nikol Pashinyan, is seeking to distance itself from its traditional alliance with Russia and look to Europe as Georgia once had. Meanwhile, the Georgian dream doesn't even have a good grip on power at home and is an incredibly unpopular government with no guarantee that it will keep the throne.
And now, let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. The South Caucasus is slowly becoming one of the world's most important regions, despite its very volatile history. One of the ways in which the region's players seek to remedy old ills is through the so-called 3+3 format.
The 3+3 format is one of the most unique diplomatic entities in the world. It is made up of two groups. The first is Armenia, Georgia and Azerbaijan, and the second is Russia, Turkey and Iran. The former are meant to use the format as a way to resolve regional disputes, while the latter are to act as mediators or offer influence and even pressure to help reach a conclusion. The idea behind the format itself has been around for far longer than most assume. It's been 20 years since something like it was first introduced by Turkey. It is not, however, smooth sailing when it comes to encouraging all the South Caucasus nations to take part. Azerbaijan is seen as a co-creator of the format along with Turkey, with whom it shares close ties. Russia has also been keen on Armenia joining the 3+3, although the recent collapse in relations between the two may have thrown a wrench into that idea. Georgia has been the most hesitant to join. On one hand, it is concerned about the powerful influence that the larger countries can exert on the smaller partners, and on the other, Tbilisi cannot afford to be sidelined by any decisions made as part of the format. With the Georgian dream's pivot to more regional politics, however, this long sought-after idea may come to pass.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, to be clear, Georgia's constitution says the president is the face of the state, commander-in-chief and foreign policy figurehead, as long as the government says it's okay. So, Saakashvili's warm words for Baku were rather binding. Aliyev's knack for controlled messaging clearly rubbed off. But let's not ignore the 400-kilo bear in the room, namely Russia. Recently, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Galuzin gave an interview saying Moscow is ready to restore diplomatic ties with Tbilisi. That sounds super nice, as long as you'll forget that Russia still occupies 20% of Georgia, has installed puppet regimes in breakaway regions, and spent the last 2 centuries treating Georgia like its annexed BNB. And yes, now Moscow suddenly remembered it shares history, faith and culture with Tbilisi. Georgian officials responded with polite but firm rejection, essentially saying, yeah, we'll talk when you give us back our stolen real estate. Meanwhile, back in Tbilisi, the streets are filled with protests. The ruling Georgian Dream Party is facing hate from all directions, from pro-European protesters to ultra-nationalist skeptics. Prime Minister Irakli Obahize hasn't helped matters either. His recent remarks suggesting the death of 2008 war hero Georgi Antsuchelidze was in vain hit the public with all the grace of a sledgehammer. As for the opposition, they are fractured into three camps: the loud, the skeptical, and the fed up. Some are still nursing wounds from Saakashvili's reign. Others are allergic to both the current government and the idea of compromise. But one thing unites them all: no one's buying Russia's sudden bursts of affection. And if you're wondering why everyone's fighting over Georgia, here's a hint: geography. Georgia is the land bridge between East and West, the pit stop between Brussels and Beijing. That's why Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and even China are jumping into the game, investing in corridors, cables, and pipelines. Azerbaijan supplies the gas, Georgia supplies the rails, Europe supplies the energy anxiety. Together, they are building a green energy corridor, a middle corridor, a don't move or I will collapse corridor. So, where does this leave us? Georgia's authoritarian adjacent pivot is becoming similar to the political freedom seen in Azerbaijan. In the South Caucasus, your neighbor is never just your neighbor. They are a potential pipeline partner, or sometimes a historical colonizer. And taken together, this makes for a very complicated geopolitical puzzle. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Grigory Lukhidze, Associate Professor at the Caucasus University. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, my pleasure to be with you.
So here we have the first international visit of Georgia's new president, Mikhail Kavelashvili, and he went straight to Azerbaijan. Now, apart from the fact that the question of the presidency in Georgia is still contested by some, not everyone recognizes him as the rightful person on that position. Let's talk about the reason why he decided to go to Azerbaijan instead of, for example, going to any European Union country, as had been the tradition in the past, before the Georgian Dream Party took over.
Well, first of all, we have to admit that he did not have a lot of options and a lot of invitations because of this political situation and the lack of his legitimacy, at least among the leaders of the European Union. That's why he paid a visit to Azerbaijan, where he was very warmly welcomed by President Aliyev, because, frankly speaking, President Aliyev's interests are completely different from the European interests towards Georgia, because official Baku has always been supporting Georgia's affiliation to the South Caucasus, which right now means the isolation from the West, because Baku sees Tbilisi as a strategic partner in terms of realization of their economic, energy, or political goals, because Georgia is a corridor in this regard. Apart from that, we have to admit, and we have to be clear, that Azerbaijan is not interested in having democratic countries, because somehow it might create a dangerous precedent where the democracy and the democratic way of living might become attractive for neighboring nations and people, like it happened in Armenia. Yes, the political situation and reality are different, Azerbaijani and Armenian, but still Ilham Aliyev prefers to cooperate with less democratic countries, the democratic ones, especially in the South Caucasus regions, because in this scenario, the cooperation becomes easier.
The situation is a bit tricky because Georgia had until recently been trying to get to the EU. I mean, it's officially still a candidate country, isn't it? Azerbaijan is not, so it's not like the European Union can criticize Azerbaijan so freely because it doesn't have the membership leverage there. But the question is this: isn't the European Union missing out in a way? Because if the countries of the region, Azerbaijan, Georgia, perhaps Armenia, and we'll talk about it in just a moment, and also further countries of Central Asia, if they cooperate, if they create some sort of common platform, they will become stronger. Well, the European Union will simply have to contend with what they decide. If they actually agree upon some sort of long-term economic cooperation, which is of course an open question, right? But these could be the first signs of that.
Exactly. The Russian Federation, together with Turkey and Iran, are aiming at launching 3+3 regional cooperation platform, which includes 3 members of the South Caucasus regions, which are Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And if this regional political platform is realized and then fulfilled fully, it means that the influences of the West and the United States of America will be much, much less than before. And of course, authoritarian countries like Russia, Iran, are deeply interested in this regional cooperation platform because, as you have mentioned, it will kick out these Western key players of the region. And in this scenario, Azerbaijan only benefits from these potential cooperation outcomes because its influence is growing. The influence of and the impact of Turkish participation in the region also will become much more meaningful than it is right now. And apart from that, we have to understand that another key player enters in the region. This is Iran, which will have extremely important leverage on Armenia in case of realization of this project. So that's a very strange game for Russia. On the one side, on the one hand, it is interested in kicking out the Western influence of the region, and from another, it understands quite well that 2 major players come back to South Caucasus fully, especially Turkey. That's why right now the South Caucasus is one of the most interesting and important from the point of view of international relations places in the world, because this is a place where I would say, major key players of the world are present, especially Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, and partially United States of America and the European Union.
So this is an interesting dilemma for the countries of the region, also potentially including Central Asian countries, because even if they would like to create some sort of platform for cooperation without the major powers, like without Russia or without China, they might not have enough funds to make themselves more attractive. For example, to build up the middle corridor, well, that would require investment, and these countries might not have enough funds. So would you say that they are doomed to cooperation with either Russia, China, Turkey, of course, also, that they do not have the potential to perhaps form a reasonably independent group of countries that would be able to stand for themselves?
Exactly. First of all, we have to understand that these countries, these 3 countries, do not share the common political goals and interests, which is another barrier in this road, on this road.
Armenia and Azerbaijan in particular, right?
Exactly. Apart from that, we have to understand the reality in which Russia, Turkey, and Iran operate. Yes, partially their interests are common, but at the same time, we have to understand that they are regional foes, because historically and traditionally, Russia and Turkey have never been allies. Yes, there are some elements of strategic cooperation, but still, the last 4 years once again illustrated that Turkey does not ask permissions to Russians and acts freely, independently, and sometimes dramatically, not only South Caucasus, where they have direct leverage over Azerbaijan, but also in the Middle East. We quite well remember the situation in Syria, where Turkish participation was visible and quite important. And that's why that's a very complicated region. And in the long run, I do not see any perspective of the realization of strategically important projects. That's a very, very short-run perspective. But from the point of view of Georgia, I would see that the situation is even dramatic, because even partial participation in such initiatives would drag away this Eastern European country even more will become even more distant from the European aspirations, which right now, even right now, are quite blurry, and in this regard, situation will be even worse.
And also, Russia wants to restore relations with Georgia, probably more so than Georgia wants to restore relations with Russia. But Georgia says, okay, there are territories which belong to us, which you're occupying. So before this is solved, no chance.
The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the State Duma have already declared about their readiness to restore diplomatic relations. They are working on this issue. The position of the Georgian government right now is quite raw, I would say. They declared directly that until the 20% of the territory of Georgia is under Russian occupation, there will be no space for the restoration of diplomatic relations. But frankly speaking, I don't trust such kind of statements, because somehow this potential restoration of diplomatic relations might be related some form of not the resolution of this conflict, because the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation a couple of times mentioned that there is no scenario in which Georgia restores its territorial integrity, because, as he said, Abkhazia and so-called South Ossetia are already independent states. That's why, in this regard, there is no perspective. But there might be some kind of solution, like common commercial area, trade area of cooperation, or at least the creation of a sort of compromise or concession made by Russia. But, the history showed that Russians did not make any concessions. And that's why every attempt of the Georgian government to sell this potential cooperation as hope for the restoration of territorial integrity will be naive. And I would say also the disinformation, because historically, once again, I repeat, Russia does not make concessions.
So there's a complicated situation there indeed, and even though all the countries involved are making an impression that they want to cooperate and build a common future, there are, as you said, divisions and rifts between them that make it rather difficult, at least in the short-term perspective. Grigor Yurkhidze was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thanks for having me.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Alarms have been set off amid Europe's diplomatic circles. Donald Trump's peace proposal, which, according to reports, may include the recognition of the Russian annexation of Crimea, has been met with concern by European and Ukrainian officials.
The rift between the United States and its European allies that has appeared under the new Trump administration is growing. Europe's capitals fear that the proposal to recognize Crimea as Russian will severely hurt transatlantic security and trust in future partnerships with the United States. What's more, London and Berlin are worried that the proposal could even derail the upcoming NATO summit in June. Observers point out that European nations aren't really in a position to stand up to the US in such a situation, given Western Europe's reliance on American protection. The Ukrainian side has already pushed back against the idea of recognizing Crimea as Russian, which has earned Kiev Donald Trump's ire. The current proposal put forward by Washington is seen as very favorable for Russia, as it also includes blocking Ukraine's NATO bid and pressuring Kiev to concede territory.
We have a very
Disgraced former commander of one of Russia's armies fighting in Ukraine, Ivan Popov, has been sentenced by a Russian military court. He is to be imprisoned for 5 years for large-scale fraud. Popov was also a critic of Russia's top brass.
The ex-commander has been stripped of his military rank as Major General and has also been fined close to $10,000, a hefty sum in Russia. He was initially arrested in May 2024 on suspicions of being a part of the theft of more than 1,700 metric tons of metal to be used in building fortifications. These were to be constructed in the Russian-occupied parts of the Zaporizhia region. The fraud had reportedly inflicted damages worth close to $1.4 million. Popov has pleaded not guilty to the charges and intends to appeal the verdict. Russian media say that he tried to avoid the prison sentence by requesting permission to return to the front in Ukraine. He was expected to lead a frontline assault group mostly composed of convicts. These units usually have very high casualty rates.
The United Kingdom says that it is banning the export of video game controllers to Russia as part of its latest sanctions package. The controllers can be repurposed to be used to pilot drones.
One of the advantages drones have over many other sectors of the military is that they can be operated using very simple everyday devices, like game console controllers. It is not uncommon for drone operators to be using standard issue controllers to send drones into enemy territory. It is therefore no wonder that London wants to limit how much of this equipment Russia can lay its hands on. The announcement itself came shortly after Ukraine's Air Force reported that Moscow launched over 200 drones and missiles in a single overnight attack. The European Union adopted a similar ban earlier this year, which also included joysticks. In addition to the controllers, the UK also said it was banning the export of software that is being used by defense and energy sectors.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.